So, there's this YouTuber called Zully the Witch, and they're a Dark Souls YouTuber, and they had a post recently that I thought was kind of interesting or like worth going into. And they got a little bit of flack for it. And I think somewhat deservingly so, because it wasn't the most clear take. So let me read this. Do developers often weigh like phobia costs in their design plans? Sometimes it's obviously unavoidable, hard to accommodate severe fear of water in a game like Subnautica. But are there conversations like considering arachnophobes? Does this need to be a spider? And he shows a picture of the spider from Limbo. This is a very strange take, and I've got my own 2 cents on it. About like showing certain fears in video games, but he did get some backlash. Like this one guy said, "God forbid there is something scary in a horror game. Go play Slime Rancher or Fortnite if you don't want to see stuff that you might find scary." And then Zully responds, "This wasn't about horror games specifically. I don't even have arachnophobia. A better example will probably have been Skyrim, since it's not meant to be a horror game, but incidentally throws a spider at the player in the intro." So I have some issues with this take. Funny enough, I am an arachnophobe, and I have played both Limbo and Skyrim. I think the reason why Zully got such a negative backlash from this take is because video games these days are already kind of in a state where everything's too streamlined, everything's too simplified, and the games kind of nanny you, and they don't seem to trust the player enough to try and figure things out for themselves or overcome challenges by themselves. Well, I don't think this was Zully's intention to suggest that maybe games should consider the fears of individual players at the expense of maybe something cool or interesting, such as the spider from Limbo. I think that's why people have such a negative backlash to what he's saying. Because it is really like an unreasonable thing that you could anticipate, because you could find anyone who has a crippling fear of X, Y, or Z. And you shouldn't, I don't think developers, if video games are arts, I don't think the artists in question should allow the possibility that the fears of some people might get in the way of their artistic expression, so to speak, and perhaps prevent us from getting something cool. But there's a bigger question here that I find more interesting, and that is video games these days really need to challenge people's sensibilities more often. And I'm not talking about like offending people with like politics or whatever, but I mean challenging them in difficulties that they're not really used to anymore. And throwing like a horror kind of enemy into a otherwise not horror game or a horror section or something that could like emotionally challenge a player, you don't really get that much these days, and that's very disappointing. So to go back to the arachnophobia example, whenever I was a kid, I was petrified with spiders. I'd have horrible nightmares about them. But over time, as I got older, and eventually I got to play games such as Limbo and Skyrim, and yes, those games were initially quite difficult for me to play, but after I played them, I did overcome those fears slightly and become, not saying that it cured my phobia, but these days as an adult, I don't mind like a spider in a room. I'm not going to shriek in horror if there's a spider in the room, but still to this day, like wouldn't really want to touch them per se. I just kind of let them live and let live. But I do think that because games like Skyrim and like Limbo challenged me in a way that was very unique to me, I did get a lot more out of it and become a lot more braver, and it had a bigger effect on me. Now, of course, whenever you do something like that, you are going to alienate someone who can't handle those kinds of fears, but the benefits for the players that can, I think vastly outweighs the detriments to the people who can't. And I think there are more people who can handle it than those who can't. And to constantly like be thinking about offending those sensibilities of people's fears can lead to being too scared to actually do anything cool. And this is what I'm talking about whenever I say games these days don't really challenge players anymore. And it's funny that this take was made by a guy who runs a Dark Souls YouTube channel, where I think that with every passing game in that franchise, the Souls games challenge the players less and less. Now, I'm not saying that as in that they're not difficult, but I mean challenge them in ways that they wouldn't expect. With every Souls game, they do more to like explain to the player exactly what they need to do, rather than let them figure something out themselves, or give them a very like cryptic clue. Like, for instance, compare the tutorial for Dark Souls versus the tutorial for Elden Ring, where like Elden Ring hand walks you through this little tutorial area with like these kind of immersion breaking prompts, and this one boss who's going to be a common enemy, and it makes sure that you know every single thing before you before the game allows you to walk forward, versus like Dark Souls, where it throws you an enemy where right out of the gate you need to figure out that the solution is not to fight it, but actually run away from into this little alcove. It challenges you to think a little outside of the box in that one area, and that leads you down a far more interesting tutorial, I think. And it also like kind of ties back into the question of, are video games art? If they are, I keep on coming back to this one speech from this one cartoon about a duck, and the duck is like saying to an audience something that still resonates with me to this day. Something along the lines of that art really ought, like, consumers really ought to demand that art offends them.
Comedy should provoke. It should blast through prejudices, challenge preconceptions. Comedy should always leave you different than when it found you. Sure, humor can hurt, even alienate. But the risk is better than the alternative. A steady diet of innocuous, childproof, flavorless mush. Demand to be challenged, to be offended, to be treated like thinking, reasoning adults.
You should demand that video games challenge you more, not just like in terms of difficulty, but also challenge your fears, challenge your thinking of the world.
Fucking maze.
Oh, and there's like a little prompt for arachnophobia. Like, it's very strange, and how like this is a very edgy, badass kind of game where like you need to be hardcore to play this. But if spiders are a little too much for you, you can turn it off in the menu. It's just, you know, like, I think we should have more faith in our players a little bit. Like, again, even back whenever I was my most scared of spiders, like, these little cartoony doodles, these little cartoony goobers aren't that scary. They don't even look that much like real spiders. And what they pick and choose is quite strange, because so far this has been a very gory game. But there doesn't seem to be like an option to turn off blood, which I would have thought would have been made more sense. So, in that sense, they ignore players' sensibilities, but if you're afraid of spiders, we've got your ass.